This is on the House Budget Committee's website. Cut the budget deficit to 3% of GDP. This was his admonition to you and to your Republican colleagues that it was a laudable goal to try to get the deficit to 3% of the GDP. Do you agree that that's a laudable goal?
Yes.
Is that something you're passionate about?
Absolutely.
What's fascinating is that the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget just issued a press release today. You might have heard it. You might have read it. I'll read you the headline. House bill would put 3% deficit far out of reach. So this goal that you have, that you seem to be particularly passionate about, is one that is not embedded in this bill that you're asking your colleagues to support, according to the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. You're familiar with that organization?
I am.
And I think they've featured you at different times. I think they've applauded you, if I'm not mistaken, in the past.
They're good people, and good people can disagree.
Let me read to you what these good people have said about your bill. They have said, and I'll quote, "Unfortunately, the House Reconciliation Bill, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, would increase deficits significantly. The House Reconciliation Bill would put the 3% deficit target further out of reach." These are your allies. I mean, these are people who are fighting for a responsible federal budget, who've been imploring the Congress to take deficits seriously. A month ago, you had folks coming in saying, Mr. Chairman, get to that 3% target. And now you have these experts that you've praised in the past telling you you're way off the mark. Make it make sense, Mr. Chairman.
Well, to get to a 3% deficit to GDP, which would stabilize the debt, you've heard the Secretary of Treasury establish a similar metric, would take $7+ trillion in spending reduction. It's a great goal, and it's a clear one, and it's measurable. But just like coming out of the World War II, 120 roughly % debt to GDP, we're comparable to that today, actually have exceeded it. It took time. And I would say this is a substantial effort and step to begin bending the curve on debt to GDP. So my analysis is different from my friends in the organization that you mentioned.
Different isn't the word I would use. I mean, different is
it is when the bottom,
different is one opinion, you know, is a bit of a deviation. They are saying you are wrong. I didn't quote it length. I mean, I'll just keep reading here. In 2022, in 2027, we estimate the House Reconciliation Bill would boost deficits to about 7% of GDP, which is more than double Besant's, the Treasury Secretary that you referenced, proposed fiscal target, 1.8% of GDP above current law and 0.7% of GDP higher than a simple extension of the Tax Cut and Job Act's individual provisions. What they're saying, I think, is that if you just simply extended the tax bill and didn't do anything else, you would reduce the deficit more than what you've done here.
I don't know how that could be even possible.
Well, because I'm reading their press release.
But we reduced, just
Sure.
Let's think through this. We reduced spending by 1.7 roughly trillion dollars. And they're suggesting by extending the tax cuts without that reduction in spending, we would be better off.
I think I can tell you why. And I'm happy to give the ranking member of the Budget Committee opportunity. It's because of the tax breaks that you have given to the richest Americans embedded in this bill, such that at the end of the day, the savings that you've described ultimately don't put the dent into the deficit that you proclaim. Ranking Member Boyle, you can correct me if I'm mistaken about that.
I like you both, but Neguse has the better side of the argument, I think quite clearly. I would point out a few things. The Committee for Responsible Federal Budget is, I have to say, admirably independent, and at times they are an equal opportunity afflictor of both sides of the political divide, depending on the piece of legislation that's coming down the pike. Their credibility is quite clear. They've been consistent when it comes to deficit and debt, and they are calling out the intellectual dishonesty in this piece of legislation. There's actually a conservative think tank called the Manhattan Institute, which indicates that the Republican bill is actually the most expensive piece of legislation since the 1960s, since Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. So it's no accident that Moody's chose this past Friday to, for the first time in American history, downgrade our debt. They've been withholding joining the other two credit agencies, one of which had downgraded our debt back in 2011 when the Tea Party Congress drove us right up to the brink in terms of whether or not we would have a debt ceiling crisis. And then there was another credit downgrade by a different credit agency a couple of years ago, which was also related to another potential crisis in terms of the debt ceiling, though that credit downgrade a couple of years ago did also reference the future trajectory of our debt. And now here we are with Moody's, for whom the trajectory, because of this legislation, of our deficits and debt was finally what prompted them to be the last of the three credit agencies to downgrade our debt. So finally, as you pointed out, what we're seeing in the bond market, that can't be spun. That can't be papered over with a gimmick like current policy baseline. The reality is these markets are charging us more now for our debt, which means higher mortgages, higher auto loan rates, higher costs for the American people.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Ranking Member Boyle. And as I go through the constellation of the entities and the individuals that have opined as to the impact of this bill on the deficit, it's pretty clear to me the conclusion. Apparently, the CBO, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, I was unaware of the Manhattan Institute's conclusions. I guess we'll add them to the list. By the way, Republicans also, Republican senators, right? I mean, Chairman, you're aware of, we don't have to go through the litany of the statements. I mean, I'm happy to read them to you, but you're aware of what Senator Rand Paul and, other colleagues of yours in the upper chamber have said about this bill and about their concerns regarding the deficit. Well, it's 3 a.m. Why not? I'll offer a few of these. May as well. This was Rand Paul today. Apparently, the speaker, I guess, met with the Senate Republicans, and this is Rand Paul's quote. Quote, the speaker basically said that conservatives just have to live with raising the debt ceiling $5 trillion or $4 trillion, which is a historic amount. And I'm one conservative who won't live with that. Senator Ron Johnson, this is a week and a half ago, quote, the one big beautiful bill, I never thought I'd be quoting Senator Johnson, but anyway, I digress. The one big beautiful bill that Congress is working on is certainly big, but beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Too often, the reality of these budget debates get obscured in details, politically charged issues, and demagoguery. Under every scenario now being considered, federal debt continues to skyrocket from its current level of almost $37 trillion. And I could go on. So Republican senators, the CBO, the Committee for the Responsible Federal Budget, my Democratic colleagues, everyone who's looked at this bill seems to conclude it is going to blow up our deficit. Everyone but you, Mr. Chairman. And I just can't understand why.
Would you like me to explain?
Yes, sure.
Well, I don't know if you know what the annual average GDP was during Trump's tenure prior to COVID, and I'm not going to ask you the questions.
I appreciate that.
But it was close to what the annual average GDP rate was for President Biden, actually, if you control for COVID, around 2.8. It was 1.8 when President Trump took over in his first year of his first term. He was able, because of the pro-growth policies, including the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, but also massive deregulation efforts, America First trade, et cetera, good energy policy, was able to move the needle by an entire 100 basis points, which over the budget window is about $3 trillion. So just to be conservative, we locked in an assumption that was lower than both, 2.6. So ironically, CBO projects the annual average growth rate at this point, which I think is actually pretty aggressive, given that they assume the tax cuts would expire, is 1.8%. So to have a conservative assumption of 2.6 plus the $1.7 trillion in spending reduction actually not only balances, but in 10 years it reduces the deficit, and more importantly, it brings the debt to GDP down, which I think is the best measure of the fiscal health of our country, by 10 percentage points.
I've given
when
you
has that ever happened?
I've given you some room to
Go ahead.
respond on that.
Thank
Can
you
I-
for the time.
Of course. Can I tell you what the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget
Well,
said about?
I wish you wouldn't.
I'd be happy to, because they actually looked at this exact issue.
Yeah,
I
sure.
think it's important. And they said, and I'll quote, most analyses have found that the House bill, that the House bill would have either a modest positive or modest negative effect on output and would not meaningfully change the annual growth rate. Yet even with the concurrent budget resolution's assumptions of 2.6%, the very percent that you just identified, average real annual growth, which is quite optimistic in the near term and highly unrealistic over a decade, deficits would remain well above the 3% target. Mr. Chairman, look, I get it.
It's one source, but-
we've been through this routine previously. I know when you testified in front of the committee before. I recognize you're here selling a product that I honestly don't think that you agree with. But, I understand the assignment. And so I will just simply tell you, I don't think that this bill is in the best interest of the fiscal health of our country. And there's a reason why virtually every expert has reached the same conclusion. I want to ask some questions of Chairman Hill, if he might indulge me. So can you just describe to us, Chairman Hill, the impetus behind the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board?
Public Company Oversight Board, what we've done is we've transferred.
No, not what you've done recently. I'm asking, why do we have it? How was it created?
It was created during the crisis around the failure of Enron.
That's right? So it's in the wake of Enron, in the wake of WorldCom, in the
And there
wake
was
of...
an assertion by the Congress at that time that all public accounting firms needed an independent regulatory body.
Correct. And that assertion, you probably are aware, was supported by an overwhelming majority of the Congress.
It was.
You know how many-
And so we're continuing that
I know.
oversight of public.
Do you know how many members of Congress voted for that bill to create the Public Accounting Oversight Board?
The vast majority. Very few people voted no.
431.
Yeah.
431, signed into law by President Bush, right? And you all have chosen to eliminate it, right?
Not true.
You're not eliminating it.
No, we're transferring the authority to oversee the public accounting from the PCAOB to the SEC.
To the SEC, got it. But you're not allocating any funding to the SEC to actually perform these duties, right? There's no money in this bill for that.
We are taking the fees that were being charged to the companies and eliminating those fees.
I understand you're limiting the fees, yes. So my point is, you've said,
We're
you've said I'm
saving
not
man-
dismantling the agency, but we're moving it to the SEC. But we're not giving the SEC a dime to do any of these critical accounting functions that virtually every Republican in the United States Congress supported a mere 20 years ago, right?
We're cutting the mandatory spending that is in this, currently in the budget for the PCOB, transferring those authorities to the SEC, and I'm sure they can come to the Congress for appropriations.
Got it. So in the interim, there will be no public accounting oversight
No.
activities, right? Yeah.
That's not true. The work
do you
of
mean?
overseeing the public accounting firms will continue.
By who?
We've contemplated that in the bill in the terms of the phase-out. It's in the reconciliation bill.
Describe it to us. I mean, I guess I'm trying to understand. You're saying it gets moved over to the SEC. There's no new funds. There's no mandate that there be...
There's a phase-out period in the reconciliation bill, and that will afford the SEC the opportunity to seek appropriations.
So does the bill it gives the SEC the opportunity to seek appropriations. So until that agent, and of course we have no idea as to whether or not the Congress will ultimately consent to that appropriation request. There's also no language in this bill that mandates that the Public Accounting Board, the personnel who work for this entity now that's been in existence for 20-some odd years, are rehired by the SEC.
That's true.
Okay. This is coupled with, obviously, we've gone to great length, and ranking member articulated well the cuts to the CFPB, and I know you don't contest that, the 70% cut, obviously, to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau.
We're taking the cap of the amount of money the CFPB can request from the Fed from 12% to 5%. It's not being cut, as the gentleman from Pennsylvania asserted, to zero. It's also not the only agency that does consumer compliance in the financial services sector either.
I understand your rationale with respect to that secondary part, but I just want to zero in here on the financial piece, because I guess my read of the bill was that it will significantly reduce the funds that are available for the CFPB to be able to perform the duties that it's responsible for executing under federal
The
law.
CFPB is often lost in federal court time and time again for exceeding its authority, proposing regulations that are not statutorily approved, proposing new functions that are not statutorily approved by Congress. And we believe that the money that is in the 5% cap is adequate for them to do their compliance responsibilities under the Act.
Yeah, again, I got your question. I hear your rationale for opposing the CFPB. I was just trying to get a better sense
I
of
didn't say that. I said we think this is the adequate
that that's
funding.
adequate for them to perform the function, but that it is a significant reduction in the resources that they have. And I understand.
In FY 2019, it was exactly around $250 million. This year in FY 25, they're proposing $800 million in spending. And yet, in our view, the spending is adequate to be at $250 million, looking at their own analysis of their own personnel, compared from when it was at its full initial operating phase in 2012 and comparing it to today. We believe it's adequate.
Okay. Financial Stability Oversight Council, reducing funding by 90%.
No.
No?
What we've done is the fees that are the budget for the Financial Stability Oversight Council, which is supported by bipartisan members in the Congress. Right. We're simply saying that it's the actual expenses. So the Office of Financial Research, where that revenue takes place, we've looked at the 3 years average use to support the FSOC's operation. We've capped it at that 3-year average level for the actual functioning expenses of FSOC. We're not eliminating FSOC. We're not eliminating the funding for FSOC.
I want to give the ranking member an opportunity to respond, and perhaps she can clarify if I'm misunderstanding the nature of the way in which FSOC's funding will be implicated. So I'd like to have that clarified.
First of all, I want to go back to
The microphone.
I want to say a word about the PCOB that is being transferred. You talked about the fact that the PCAOB was being transferred to the SEC. And you wanted to know whether or not there were any funds that followed that. And the answer by Chairman Hill was that they could come and ask for more money. But it is really a lot more serious than simply whether or not they have the money. They had a hard time getting an agreement with the Chinese that are in our financial markets. But under the Biden administration, they were able to work out an agreement with the Chinese that was very, very important. Now, that agreement does not extend to the SEC. And so that means that the SEC, the auditors won't be able, perhaps, to deal with China, Germany, and a lot of the other places. So this is very, very serious, and I just wanted to say that. Next, you were talking about the council.
FSOC.
About why it is so important and what is happening to it. Well, the council is very important because we are at a time when all of these crazy tariffs are being initiated by the President of the United States of America, and we have rising inflation also. This means that the cost of loans are going to be much more expensive. I want you to know that investors around the world are freaking out, unsettled about what is happening. And so what you have is not only the unsettlement, but the uncertainty that is being created by these tariffs. And we haven't talked a lot about tariffs here tonight. And the president is given all these excuses why he wakes up in the morning and decides that he's going to change the amount of the tariffs. And he said that the reason that we're having all these tariffs is they aren't paying their fair share, going to use the new money that he's going to collect for manufacturing, et cetera, et cetera. He's going to do all of that. However, I want you to know that these tariffs are being placed on bananas and coffee, and that has nothing to do with what he's saying he's going to use the money for. So the council is so very important as we take a look at what needs to be known with this crisis that's being created and how the federal government could get involved much sooner than what happened in 2008. And so we need it. If you just take a look at what happened with AIG, which is one of the biggest problems that had to be corrected, they got in charge of that, and they were able to not only give new oversight, but it was restructured, and it was no longer a threat. So it's very important to have the council and the research that goes along with it.
Well, I would say, thank you, Madam Ranking Member, and I would just say, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Hill, I respect your expertise. I know you've worked on these issues. I know you've served in the Treasury Department, and I understand the policy reasons that you might have, and
We were directed,
and
Mr.
believe.
Neguse.
Well, let me finish. It wasn't a question. That you believe with respect to some of the changes that you're seeking to make. My simple suggestion is that the changes you are making to the Accounting Board, to the CFPB, to FSOC, taken together in the aggregate, all of these agencies, these entities were created for a reason, right? And they were in the wake of very serious financial crises that engulfed our country. And I just don't think that it's in the best interest of American consumers to pursue these kinds of changes. I also think they're policy changes, and that, you know, ultimately if the parliamentarian in the Senate is abiding by precedent, that they shouldn't make it through the birdbath, but that's a different inquiry. So in any event, I will move on. My final question to Chairman Comer. Mr. Chairman, so with respect to the exchange you were having with one of my colleagues earlier about the exemptions that you all crafted into the bill regarding air traffic controllers, that's in relation to the at-will, this distinction essentially between giving federal employees the choice of choosing the at-will employment versus non-at-will employment, federal protections, but a higher retirement contribution. Am I right that that's what the exemption is applying to?
What's that? I mean, I don't understand your question.
Why don't you describe to me, I wanted to better understand the new language, the language that you all have adopted regarding air traffic controllers and law enforcement.
They're exempted from any changes.
Any of the changes that you all are making with respect to the federal benefits system. That's correct?
Yes.
Okay. That didn't exist in the original bill, or was that not the case?
There were exemptions for Border Patrol, and Yeah, they were. I guess you could say partially exempt.
Yeah, and that's the genesis of my question was, okay. I'm really drilling down on, and your staff director, I think can probably attest to this issue around the provision that I would say compels, you would say offers federal employees this choice to choose at-will employment and a higher contribution for their retirement benefits, right, or to stay within the federal protected system and have to pay a higher contribution on their end. That original provision did not have the exemptions that you all have added now for law enforcement, for Border Patrol, for air traffic controllers. That wasn't in the bill that you all marked up a few days ago that the Republican majority on the bill approved. Or am I wrong about that?
That's correct.
Okay. What I am interested in is, was there a discussion, and are you willing to have a discussion, particularly as you consider a manager's amendment, to draw out a similar exemption for veterans. So veterans who have rights under the merit, in the current system, if you're a veteran and you work at any of our federal agencies, right, but you don't fall into this particular job classification exemption, you have rights before the Merit Systems Protection Board that you can adjudicate, right, as a veteran. And my point is to simply say, why wouldn't you draw out this exemption to include veterans, irrespective of whether or not they fall into this classification or not?
Look, the bill can be amended through the process. I mean, this is, we passed out, we were given instructions to save $51 billion. We met that. And look, during discussions, there's going to be minor changes made here and there. With respect to at will, I want to make it clear there are certain states that have at will civil service employees. Some of those states are Georgia, Texas, Florida, and Utah. So I don't think there's anything groundbreaking or unique here.
No, I'm not. But what I'm suggesting is you crafted this exemption over the course of the last 72 hours. You added a very large exemption to this bill. That's an exemption I support, by the way, with respect to what you've drawn out here. Clearly, you have the capacity to just add veterans. You could do that now. There's negotiations apparently happening somewhere in this building. And Ranking Member McGovern and Chairman Arrington's colloquy, I think, established that. So I don't really understand why you wouldn't just make the case to the leadership, respectfully, Mr. Chairman, to say, okay, if this exemption was worth pursuing, let's add veterans as well, so that we're not forcing veterans into this Hobson's choice that we've decided we did not want to force upon firefighters, air traffic controllers, and other law enforcement officials. I think that's a reasonable request to make on behalf of our nation's veterans. And as you know, a large portion of the federal workforce are veterans. So I think that this would be the least we could do. And I would implore you, I don't know if you have further thoughts on that, but I mean, you're the chairman, and I assume you negotiated this
we've already
exemption,
passed our bill out of the committee, so it's not.
But this amendment happened after you marked up the bill. That's my point. You passed the bill. It included no exemptions for police officers, for firefighters, for border patrol. It was a limited exemption, as your staff director noted. You've added that in the last couple of days because there were stakeholders who made clear their outrage, which, by the way, was expressed by Democrats, I understand, during the markup, and Ranking Member Lynch can comment on that if he'd like, but I think Democratic members of the committee made the case that this ought to be, obviously, we believe it should be
Well,
eliminated
Democrats want to
entirely,
spend, into oblivion. I mean, if it were just Democrats, there wouldn't be any cuts.
Well,
We
I
just
would
keep spending money and
I
keep
would
adding
I
to the
would not
deficit.
call.
I mean, somebody has to step
I
up,
would
and
not call.
we're on an
Mr.
unsustainable path.
Mr. Neguse,
Mr. Chairman, respectfully,
Mr.
I would not
Neguse,
call. I'm
Mr.
almost done,
Neguse,
Madam Chair. I would respectfully
You ask
say,
a question.
he
Mr.
answered.
Comer was attempting to answer
He
your
answered.
question.
Okay.
You know, Mr. Neguse, there is no prize here for talking the longest.
Well,
And
Madam Chair,
so,
I had intended to finish, but I've got about 7 more questions. I guess I'll proceed with Mr. Comer. Mr. Comer, go ahead and finish your question, or your answer, sorry.
Look, I've stated the obvious. We are trying to do the best we can to be fiscally responsible. It's no fun when you have to make cuts. You all don't know what that's like. You've never cut anything in your life. You just continue to spend. We're on an unsustainable path. We have limited jurisdiction on the Oversight Committee. We're very passionate about eliminating waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement in the federal government. With respect to this bill, we had a limited portion of jurisdiction, and I think that we've been very transparent with the process. We passed out of committee a bill that saved the taxpayers $51 billion. There have been changes made, as there always is, once the bill passes committee before it's voted on the floor. So I don't know what else there is to say.
So I would say to you, now that you've apparently concluded your answer, that my question was really simple. Really simple. I wasn't asking you to draw out exemptions for this category of folks and other categories of folks. It was very simple. A simple question, which was, are you willing to consider carving out an exemption for our nation's veterans in the same way that you drew out an exemption after the committee marked up this bill? I don't think that's spending into oblivion to say that our nation's veterans should be exempted in the same way that our law enforcement and border patrol agents and air traffic controllers. I don't think that's an unreasonable request. Ranking Member Lynch, do you think that's an unreasonable request?
No, as a matter of fact, one of the amendments I have is to exempt them from the change in the calculation going from the high 3 to high 5. We would maintain the veterans at the high 3, and
just to
know,
be clear,
and
they
cost
could do
of
that right now.
They could, and the cost, and they've done it, as you pointed out, they've done it for a narrow subset of employees, and that, you know, the high 3 instead of the high 5 was about $16,500 per employee over 20 years of retirement. Not a huge sum of money, but definitely appropriate, given that a veteran must have served honorably and discharged honorably for them to be eligible for these benefits.
Yeah, well, I couldn't agree more, Mr. Lynch. And again, Republicans are negotiating right now as we speak on SALT deductions and tax credits and any host of issues that members of your caucus have. And I would think that the least they could do is entertain, or at least not treat it so gingerly that the response of, this is spending into oblivion because we have a simple request. It was the only question that I asked you, Mr. Comer, and so I'm taken aback by your answer. But anyway, I will yield back, bounce my time. I thank the ranking members and the chairs for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Neguse. Ms. Houchin, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being here this evening, and particularly to our committee chairs for their hard work on this reconciliation bill. Many hours have gone into this, many hours of debate outside of tonight in the broad daylight have gone on this bill. I want to make a few points before I get into questions, and that is in response to a few of the things that have been said by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. One of the things that's been said is that